Welcome to My Hometown, the program that explores clubs, organizations, businesses, and issues across Nassau and Suffolk counties and sheds light on the different towns that are making a difference.
Hello and welcome to My Hometown. I'm Bill Horan, along with my co-host, Nassau Community College student Mike DeMarco.
Bill, I have my credit cards ready and I already have a bunch of shopping bags and I'm ready to talk about Roosevelt Field.
Mike, you're right. We're talking about Roosevelt Field on today's show, but we're going to talk about what it was like before it was a shopping mall.
Okay, that makes more sense since the book we're talking about has an image of an old airplane on the cover. So what am I supposed to do with all these shopping bags now?
Mike, that's your problem. Today we're going to speak to Richard Panchyk. He's the author of a book called Roosevelt Field Through Time from Arcadia Publishing and the History Press. Richard, welcome to My Hometown on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you very much for having me here today.
Richard, this is a fascinating subject because I think everybody who's listening to the show, certainly myself, Mike, we've been to Roosevelt Field numerous times, so it's exciting to learn some history about it. But tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into studying the history of Roosevelt Field.
Well, I've always been interested in history ever since I was in high school, and I started working on history books about 20 years ago, and I wrote a book about Westbury, the history of my hometown, Westbury, and that mentioned, of course, Roosevelt Field because it's right there, and that got me going on the topic of some of the local interest spots in the area. So Roosevelt Field was definitely one that I wanted to cover, and I was surprised to find that really there wasn't much out there about Roosevelt Field as far as books for consumption by the public. So I thought, this is something that so many people are familiar with the mall, and yet how many of them really know the history of what was there before it?
You must be a fascinating person to sit next to, whether it's on a bus, an airplane, a cocktail party. I would think the information you must have, not only about Roosevelt Field, but Long Island in general, is fantastic.
Yeah, don't get me started.
We're going to get you started. We want to get you started.
So there were many airports in operation around the New York City metro area by the 1930s. What made Roosevelt Field so special?
Well, Roosevelt Field was special because it had the heritage that really no other airport could claim. It had the heritage of the cradle of aviation, and you've heard that term probably because of the museum that's right near here. But it had the heritage because it was the spot where Roosevelt Field was born was actually one of the earliest airfields in the area. And the earliest flyers came here to Roosevelt Field, to what was before it was even Roosevelt Field, to fly their planes back when planes were just a few years out from the Wright brothers. You know, this was really the pioneering time in aviation history, and Roosevelt Field was born from that spot, from those very, very early airfields, circa 1910 and 11. And of course, it wasn't named Roosevelt Field until 1919, but the heritage was there, and it really had retained that very special meaning.
If we passed it at the time, did it encompass much more than what we see today? Because, of course, we know Roosevelt Field, the first image is a shopping center, but there's a lot of ground around it. And, of course, in the early days of Long Island, mostly farm and open areas. So if we pulled up to it back in the beginning when you've been researching it, what would it look like to us?
Well, in those days, the nerve center of Roosevelt Field was right around where Old Country Road and Clinton Road meet. That corner there was where all the hangars and the base buildings and operations were. And then, of course, the runways extended from there, going somewhat south and then mainly going east from there. But around it, there wasn't much. There were the beginnings of some development of homes to the north, but not that much by the 1920s. And you had the village of Westbury further to the east and north. And you had what was then a golf course where Eisenhower Park is. And you had to the west, you had Garden City, which was by then thriving. But there was still a lot of open land. And it was a very formidable place for flying because it was so much open land. It was perfect, really, for taking off and landing.
Yeah, when you think of it, Mike, this what better place could you have It's an island. It's open. Around you are farms. And really, it's a win-win.
When Glenn Curtiss came down to this area looking for a place where he could set up operations, he was already a famous aviator. He chose this area, the Hempstead Plains, specifically because it was so good. He thought it was perfect for flying. And for many decades, it was the perfect place.
So I guess that's why we get those strong winds sometimes. We're out in the parking lot. Might have something to do with the choice. But I know there's some famous experiments, flying experiments that sort of took place or projects in this area. Can you talk a little bit about the famous Lindbergh Flight events leading up to it? And, the events leading up to it. I'm curious, would Roosevelt Field, or do you think Roosevelt Field would still be famous if not for the Lindbergh?
I think so, because there were so many important flights that took place, either taking off from Roosevelt Field or landing at Roosevelt Field. And it was just, there were stunts and daredevils, and there were aviation schools, and there was just so much going on. It still would have been famous. But of course, the Lindbergh Flight cemented its place in history forever. And, in 1927, by that time, there had been great advancements in aviation, yet there was still a challenge to, think about today. We just take a plane and fly across the ocean with no problem, and we don't think about it much. But back in those days, nobody had done it yet. It had not been accomplished. In 1919, there had been a flight that went across the ocean. It took off from the Rockaways, and it made many stops along the way. It hopped across, and that was considered a huge accomplishment. And between 1919 and 1927, nobody really could manage to do what Lindbergh did. And there was a prize. There was a monetary prize for this accomplishment. Whoever could do it first, fly across the Atlantic in one bound. And there were several contenders, and they all were trying to use Roosevelt Field. It made sense because obviously you wanted to fly from somewhere that was closest to the ocean and head east from there. But Lindbergh was just one of a few, and it just happened that it worked out for Lindbergh. He was actually a late arrival to Roosevelt Field among the others, but there had been some bad luck. One of the contenders was Richard Byrd, who later became Admiral Byrd, a famous explorer, Arctic region. But future Admiral Byrd was one of the contenders for this prize, and unfortunately an accident left his hand injured. So in my book, I have a photo of him coming out of his hangar at Roosevelt Field, and you can actually see his hand kind of held gingerly toward his plane, the America, and this was in May of 1927. He would have probably succeeded if he had not been injured, but his hand needed to heal, and so Lindbergh wound up taking off first, and he managed to do that and fly across the ocean and win the prize.
Those are always the fascinating stories, when the backstory, when we find out what really went on, etc. So, Mike?
Yeah, imagine history might have been a little bit different. Is that place where the Lindbergh took off, because obviously things are very different now, is that place marked off, or can we find that if we're walking around in the area? Do they have that marked off?
Well, so there's a couple of things to note. There's a spot where Lindbergh's plane had been stored in the hangar, which was along Old Country Road, and that was one of the last buildings to be demolished when Roosevelt Field was demolished. That's not marked. There is also the spot where he boarded his plane, which is not marked at all. And then there's a spot where his plane became airborne, which is marked. It's just south of the garage at what was formerly the Source Mall, Fortunoff Source Mall. And there's a very small stone monument with a depiction of an airplane, Lindbergh's airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, on it that you could easily miss. It's kind of surrounded by shrubs. That marks the spot. It's probably like 3 or 4 feet high. It's a very small monument. That marks the spot where his plane became airborne, and that's the only thing. I believe there was also inside the Fortunoff food court the mall food court, there was some hanging airplane or something that was supposed to be a memorial to that flight. But really, there was no tangible evidence of anything other than that one spot, which is marked with a very unassuming little memorial, sadly. And there was a very small movement during the days when Roosevelt Field was about to be shut down and demolished to save something, to do something, but nothing became of that movement. So that's why we're where we're at today.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because I feel like people pass by and all they see are shopping malls, shopping centers, and it would be beneficial if there was at least a small park in the area. But before we continue, I just want to add that you are listening to My Hometown on the Voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Mike DeMarco, along with Bill Horan, and today we are talking with Richard Panchyk, the author of a new book called Roosevelt Field Through Time, from Arcadia Publishing and the History Press. Bill?
Richard, I'm fascinated again. Was Roosevelt Field a place just for expert flyers and famous pilots? Or like when we see a school ground today, kids go out there with their drones or their race cars and they'll use it. Who really made use of Roosevelt Field?
Roosevelt Field maybe was known because of these famous flyers who came to visit and to fly, but it was very much a civilian airfield for everybody. And there were flying schools there. You could look in the papers back then. You would look and see advertisements for aviation schools, and anybody could sign up for flight lessons. In fact, some of going back to the early days of Roosevelt Field before it was known as that, certainly there were people, young aviators, learning how to fly. And then going forward in time, it continued. That tradition continued. So alongside people like Lindbergh, you had the average person who wanted to take a flying lesson. And that's also what made Roosevelt Field special.
Now, were there a lot of airplane crashes associated with Roosevelt Field? I know you got a lot of new pilots in this area and sort of possible experimental flights. Were there a lot of accidents that took place?
Absolutely, yes. There and a lot of these accidents, thankfully, it's an interesting word to use, thankfully, but thankfully they're documented. Many of the accidents that took place during World War I era, when Roosevelt Field had been a civilian airfield and it was converted to military use during World War I. And because these were photographs taken by government photographers, many of these have been preserved in the National Archives. So there's a whole mess of photos of crashes, Roosevelt Field crashes that happened during these training exercises. And, many of them were not fatal. Some of them were fatal. And after the war, when it became a civilian airfield again, there were still crashes. And you'd read about that. I wrote about that in my book on Westbury. There are crashes that happened in downtown Westbury on Maple Avenue. In Carl Place, a plane crashed right down the street. This happened with some frequency, not a lot, but just imagine how many airplanes did take off from there and how close you were to homes. And that was one of the factors in the end that helped contribute to ending Roosevelt Field, to closing it, is that it just became too built up.
That's what I was thinking. The towns around it now, as they're building up, you have homes, probably farms at that time, with expansive areas for their crops. But there's still people living there. There's still stores, and I guess you have to be a little more careful as the area became commercialized.
Yes, the area just north of Old Country Road by the 1940s was being built up. So you cross Old Country Road to the south, you have the airfield, and then just north you have all these residences that are being built. And then you go to the west and you've got more residences. And then you're getting, it's encroaching now. And you also, to the south, you had, of course, Mitchell Field. But there was a growing population, and there was also noise issues too with associated with an airport, of course.
What caused the eventual closing of it as an airport? Was it like today, it'd be more useful as an apartment house or a shopping center or a racetrack?
Well, also you had a few different factors. Of course, you had the the very fact that air aviation was changing and growing, and Roosevelt Field was a spot where you had flights that were commercial flights that were small, small planes carrying a number of people, maybe let's say 5, 10, 20 people, and those flights would land and take off from Roosevelt Field and go locally. But as air aviation developed over time and you had better capabilities and bigger airplanes, there was maybe a little bit less of that need, especially if you had other airports in the area. And then you had, of course, the encroachment of the residences and the noise and the safety issues. And add into that a developer who thinks they can make money by selling this large property in what would become the Nassau hub. This is a very central area. And that developer, the developers, of course, realized the potential of this property, this huge property that wasn't bringing in very much money by then. It kind of stalled after the war. Before the war, it was doing fairly well. It converted back to a military air base during World War II. And then after the war, it never picked up again the way it had been. So it was on the decline already. And it marked the end of an era, pretty much.
Why was nothing at all preserved from such a famous place as Roosevelt Field? I know we have the Cradle of Aviation Museum. I know that's probably done afterwards in hindsight, and there's a very small, I'm still hung on that they had such a small, I guess, little monument, so to speak, for the Lindbergh Flight. Why was nothing sort of, preserved or kept as in remembrance? I'm sure most people don't even, younger generations don't even know about the airfields that they existed. Why wasn't there more of a preservation that took place?
It's a good question, and it's very hard to imagine that such a place even existed.
Yeah.
When you drive by, you have to. That's why I was excited about this book, because so many people live in this area or shop in this area or work in this area, and yet how many of them really remember the days, or old enough to remember the days, or even know what was there before? And it's hard to imagine. In developing, like I said, Lindbergh, the hangar where Lindbergh's plane was for a while afterwards still there along Old Country Road, but it was demolished too. It's almost like there was just no forward thinking, no ability to really understand the history of it until much later on. Now, interestingly, what happened here, where we're at right now at Mitchell Field, and we're sitting in one of the original buildings that was part of the Mitchell Field Air Base complex. That's still here. It's been repurposed. And I think part of the reason that a lot of Mitchell Field infrastructure is still here is because it was publicly owned. And when you have something publicly owned, it costs money to do anything with it. And so it made sense to just leave it. A lot of the stuff that's still here at Mitchell Field is here not by design so much, but as by it made sense economically, and to rather than to just demolish it. But one interesting thing about where we're at now, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's still a little bit of runway left from Mitchell Field here on the Nassau Community College campus, kind of hidden away. And in fact, there was more 10, 15 years ago, and it's been slowly encroached upon and demolished. There's a new police headquarters that's been built, and that's on the spot where there was more of the runway. The spot that was demolished was where a famous scene from the movie The Godfather was filmed. The toll booth scene that was supposed to take place at Jones Beach took place here at Mitchell Field on that runway. So again, you have things even now that are being demolished without much concern. And it's very hard. It's hard to balance the need for moving toward the future versus the need for preserving the past.
Wow, I didn't even know that Godfather scene was filmed right there. It's really interesting. I probably passed by it even like several times. You don't even think about it. I mean, it just goes to show you. But before we continue, I just want to add once again. You are listening to My Hometown on the Voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Mike DeMarco, along with Bill Horan. And today we are talking with Richard Panchyk, the author of a new book called Roosevelt Field Through Time, from Arcadia Publishing and the History Press. Bill?
Richard, I know you mentioned in your book that you actually found some relics on the site. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, as I was looking around the Roosevelt Field site, especially the former center of operations, that corner, Old Country Road and Clinton Road area, where there's right now an office building and then the entrance toward Roosevelt Field, and a restaurant and some other things in that area, but a big parking lot too. I noticed in the ground there were some pieces of old iron or steel, and I wasn't sure what they were. And it took a lot of research and I have pictures of them in the book. It took a lot of research to figure out, because they're so obscure at this point. But I figured out that they were concrete formwork ties that were used to hold the formwork, like the wooden formwork, in place when you poured the concrete for foundations of buildings. So doing some research and looking at old maps and trying to figure out what these could have been used for, I determined that there was no way these were used for anything for the Roosevelt Field Mall complex, and that these would have had to have dated to the Roosevelt Field Airport period, because before that there was nothing there. And the location where I found these roughly corresponded to a storage/garage building, hangar building, that was on the site and during the 1920s and 30s. So I'm thinking that what I found was perhaps some of the actual last relics of Roosevelt Field.
You become a real investigator in order to do what you've done. It must be fantastic when you come up with something like that, almost like a great detective or archaeologist.
Yeah, and in college I wanted to become an archaeologist. I majored in anthropology. I studied archaeology. And so it turns out that I'm putting my skills to use in my original dream of becoming an archaeologist to use now in my writing and doing research like that to literally dig deeper into history. There
was something called Roosevelt Raceway, and for some of us who've been around a while, there were actually flea markets there. And I imagine when you talk about that to younger people today, they go, Roosevelt Raceway, what the heck was that? I'm trying to think I certainly remember it, but I'm trying to think when it actually closed. I'm guessing, I'm going to say in the early 2000s. I don't know if I'm right. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the raceway was on the eastern end of the Roosevelt Field property. So originally Roosevelt Field Airfield took the entire length from Clinton Road all the way to Ellison, and it stretched. It was a huge expanse, and by the 1930s, the eastern portion of it was broken away into Roosevelt Raceway. It originally was developed for use as the Roosevelt, not as the Roosevelt Raceway specifically, but as to host the Vanderbilt Cup race in 1936, which was a descendant of the original Vanderbilt Cup that had been in the area in the early 1900s.
Let me just interrupt. What kind of race was that? Was that a horse race as we think?
That was an automobile race.
It was? Okay, I thought so. That's why I wanted to write.
It was built as an automobile racetrack, and it was used as such for a few years. And then in 1940, it was converted to I believe it was the country's first harness racing track.
Wow.
So, and it stayed that way for a long time. In the 1960s, early 60s, it wound up being split, and the northern part of that property became Orbach's and Fortunoff, and the southern part remained Roosevelt Raceway.
And by the way, again, for our audience, because it's going back now, Fortunoff's and Orbach's were department stores.
Yes.
And that was kind of, I'm trying to think, Old Country Road and I forget the crossroad over there. But it was kind of the end, I guess, of that piece of commercial property there.
Correct.
Okay.
And going back to your question earlier about the inn, yeah, that was a place where flyers and civilians alike could gather and have a meal or get together, and of course, it actually remained open till the very end. it was a popular spot, but like the rest of the field, it went down in not in flames, but in a cloud of rubble as it was demolished.
Oh, man.
I'm just wondering, Mike, not to interrupt, do you remember about when the racetrack closed up?
You're probably close to on target with
On the
that.
2000s, yeah.
Yeah, it was somewhere in that area. I have it.
That's
written
okay.
down
It's
somewhere.
not. I was just got myself thinking of it. When you get a statistic in your mind. Mike?
Now, I assume that's also has something to do with the name of the movie theater that's there. It used to be the Raceway.
Yes,
It was
that
called.
the whole area where Target is and the movie theater and all those parking lots was all part of the Raceway complex. And I believe that the Raceway closed down long before it was demolished. So for a while it was sitting there empty. So it closed
Kinda
down
raunchy for a while.
It closed down and became it had flea market, like you said, and other stuff going on. It literally was sitting vacant until it was finally developed, and you see all these apartments and condos and buildings now. So it's quite impressive in a way that you don't even know, just like with Roosevelt Field Airfield, other than the names of some of these streets and the names of some of these complexes, you don't even know that there was a horse racing track there unless you remember it.
And it takes the older people, because I'm thinking, for instance, students at Nassau Community College today, they'd be in their 20s. They'd be little kids when the racetrack was demolished. They probably would not have remembered it unless they had a special connection to it, or their father or mother worked there, something like that. So really a fantastic amount of history. You must be a joy. I'm going to say, you won't say this about yourself, but to talk to and to learn about Long Island history.
Right, and I just recently, very recently, a couple of months ago, another book came out called Eisenhower Park Through Time, which is directly across from this whole area. Of course, it's right across the street from all this stuff. And that's another spot that is full of history. So there's so much history in the area. The Long Island Motor Parkway came through here. The central branch of Long Island Railroad came through right nearby where we are today. So there's a lot of history, and my goal is to try to preserve it, because even as we speak, things are being demolished and changed.
Well, you're doing a great job. We want our audience to know our guest today has been Richard Panchyk. He is the author of a book, Roosevelt Field Through Time, from Arcadia Publishing and the History Press. Richard, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm Bill Horan. I'm here with Mike DeMarco. We thank you for listening to this week's special edition of My Hometown.
We like to get your feedback on My Hometown. Send your comments to whpc@ncc.edu. Nassau Community College, where success starts and continues. Till next time, this is Bill St. James. And remember, there's no town like your hometown.